Good afternoon and welcome to Gript. This afternoon I'm joined by John Crawley, who's the author of a recently published book called Yank, which describes his time as a US Marine and his later period which he spent as an IRA volunteer and 2 periods in prison as a consequence of being an IRA volunteer. I'd like to begin by asking John to give just a basic introduction to his own life.
Well, Matt, basically I was born in America to Irish immigrant parents in 1957. My father was from Roscommon, my mother was from Kerry. My father was in the American Air Force at the time and doing a 4-year stint. And we moved to Chicago when I was about 2. And I just had the normal upbringing of most Irish American kids. I went to Catholic school and had a sense of Irishness, but it wasn't that overly strong. But then I came to Ireland for summer when I was 13, and then we moved back to Ireland when I was 14. So I lived in Ireland during very formative years. I was always a voracious reader, especially in politics and history. And even though I had no Republican background or heard no Republican propaganda, so to speak, from home or from anybody else, I formed a conclusion that while the struggle for Irish freedom was ongoing in the North, that I wanted to play a role in that. I didn't know anybody in the IRA when I was 18, so I decided on my own initiative to go to the United States, join the US Marines, get the best training I possibly could. When I was in the Marines, I was in with their special operations group known as Recon. I eventually became an instructor. I got out of the Marines on the 29th of May, 1979 at 8 in the morning, and at 2 that afternoon, I was on a flight home for Ireland. It took me a while to learn to, get into the IRA because I didn't know anybody. It wasn't called a secret army for nothing. But eventually, I learned of a fellow who'd been in Portlaoise prison and was working in a building site. I approached him, and he actually discouraged me. But eventually, I was approached by somebody from County Tyrone, and gradually, and it's all in the book. It's outlined in the book. I eventually ended up in the IRA. And I went full-time and became a full-time activist around 1980.
Yeah, I've joined myself about 6 or 7 years later, and really was like entering into a completely different world. You felt like you were joining history, but unfortunately, as you describe in your book, and as many of us found out to our misfortune, that especially I suppose coming from your background in the American Marines, that you were joining an organisation that wasn't particularly sophisticated, or certainly not as sophisticated as a lot of people believed, and as perhaps there was a myth among Republicans which was generally accepted too. And there's one quote which particularly stood out to me, where you make a reference to what you describe as managerial ineptitude on an Olympian scale among the IRA leadership. Perhaps you might kind of describe to people who are watching exactly what you meant by that.
Well, I didn't join the IRA with any intention of professionalizing it or making it a better organization. I joined the Marines for my own professional development and to test my commitment to join the IRA. So I knew if I was away from Ireland for 4 years and I came back and still wanted to join, I knew that commitment was genuine, which is what I did. But I really did believe that the IRA was this professional, sophisticated organization that I kept hearing about. But I kept hearing about it from the British. It was the British who were constantly saying the IRA was the best trained, most highly organized, most sophisticated guerrilla army in the world, essentially. So I actually didn't think the IRA needed my help in it particularly, but I wanted to join. So when I did, I rapidly learned that things weren't quite what I thought they were, that there was a lot to be desired in training and in procurement of weapons and in standardization of weapons. Just I found that training was very poor, that in marksmanship and, for example, some of the training actually was counterproductive because people were being told the wrong thing. And in other areas, I found no tactical training, no basic military tactical training at the most basic level wasn't there. Now, I did find the volunteers on the ground were very keen to learn, But when I brought this up to members of leadership, I was almost universally dismissed as they would repeat the British mantra. Sure, even the Brits say we're the best trained organization in the world. I heard two different members of the Army Council tell me, sure, you could train a monkey to shoot. That was their attitude. And it was very hard to, it was impossible actually to break through that. So what I meant by managerial ineptitude is there were very, very many IRA volunteers over the years who had served in various, who had had professional military training in the Irish Army, the British Army, French Foreign Legion. There were volunteers who had served in elite military units like the British Parachute Regiment, the Royal Marines. I ran the gamut, right? We had teachers in our ranks who could, draw up lesson plans and draw up a course structure. And we had artists in our ranks who could design effective and informative training aids. Yet, never was there a skills audit done to put people together and to professionalize the IRA in the way that the Brits said we were. And I found that, as I said in the book, it was either managerial ineptitude or, as I came to suspect, it was subtle sabotage.
Yeah, what struck me and was kind of reminded me of things that had occurred to me over the years, and having met people, many of them you would know yourself and in prison and elsewhere over the years, that you had basically a community in revolt, in armed revolt in places like South Armagh, Tyrone, Belfast, and supported by a large number of people who were not members of the IRA, but were putting their own, you described your own experience in border area in that respect, who were putting themselves and their families at great risk. And you would often think, I remember I spent 2 years on the road myself, that the level of courage and commitment on the part of those people who you'd have known, the people who were killed in Tyrone at Loughgall and people from South Armagh and other parts of the country, that they were ill served by the people who were supposed to be, as dreadful T-shirts with a certain person's face on, said, "We will lead you to the Republic." Whether they had any intentions of re-leading anybody to the Republic is besides the point. But did you form the impression, as many other people I think have?
I certainly found no evidence there was an intention to do any otherwise than that. But you see, a lot of what our problems was masked by the fact. See, basically, you need three things to have any hope of success in an armed campaign. You need the skill, you need the capacity, and you need the motivation. Now, volunteers in the early 80s, especially, and in certain areas like East Tyrone and South Armagh and places like that, they certainly had the motivation. They were lacking in skill, but we didn't have the capacity. We didn't have the equipment to push it on to where we thought it could go. However, when we did get the capacity, for example, when the shiploads of guns came in from Libya, which is a matter of public record, it's a matter of public knowledge. Once we did have the capacity, I think that flagged up and exposed a lot of weaknesses at a leadership level, because they certainly didn't have the motivation to give us the skill to use the equipment. Because from the time that equipment came in until the ceasefire in 1994, when we were the most highly armed in our history and with the greatest capacity of any Republican revolutionary group in history, our effectiveness went down every year. British military and police casualties actually decreased every year when we had the highest capacity in our history. So that tells a lot in itself. Now, many people thought, including myself, that equipment should have been used to fight an enhanced war of national liberation. But I think others saw it as negotiating capital to maneuver themselves into positions that would enhance future political careers. I don't think there's a solid argument to refute that. Not one that I've heard anyway. And but a lot of this, you see, was incomprehensible to people on the ground because we never had a big picture. We never got the big picture. It's only years later, like people like myself, talking to people for the first time, we're able to connect a lot of dots And a lot of things are becoming clear now that weren't clear then. And it's not a good picture. It's not a good picture. Now, nobody in their right mind believed for a second that we would ever beat the British Army into the sea. We always knew this would end in negotiations. But I would have assumed or presumed, and I think most would have, that when we got to the negotiating table, the Irish Republic would be on the table. But what the Brits do is they set the table and they prepare the menu. And there was only one or two items on the menu, and the Irish Republic wasn't there. They've done the very same thing in the Anglo-Irish treaty debates when they brought in partition before the treaty negotiations took place. So what the Brits do, and in the situation we had here in the more recent talks, we had the Downing Street Declaration, we had the Mitchell Principles, and we had the framework documents. And basically what the Brits were doing is they were shaping the strategic environment of where this could go before it went anywhere. And that's what they do. And we never got an Irish Republic because that they promised they'd lead us to, because it wasn't on the table. It wasn't even a matter for discussion. And what I mean by an Irish Republic basically was the vision we had of a national democracy within an all-Ireland republic that would substitute, Protestant Catholic Centre for the common aim of Irishmen. In other words, that we would have a joint civic identity. Nobody denies for a second that Ulster Unionists are a distinct community, but they are not a separate nation. I mean, even the British don't accept they're a separate nation. I mean, when King Charles came here recently, a week or two ago, the British were saying he was visiting the four nations of the UK. I mean, going by that logic, he should have said the five nations of the UK, England, Scotland, Wales, and the two nations in Ireland. But, it's amazing that when Ireland is under British rule, it's one nation. But as soon as we talk about, a national democracy within all Ireland Republic, suddenly we're two nations. So my argument with the Good Friday Agreement is, I'm all for the peace. When we talk about the peace process, I support the peace, and I'm not advocating a return to armed struggle. I am not. I do say that when we were at armed struggle and we had the capacity, we should have pursued it until the Irish Republic was on the table. But that didn't happen, and that ship has sort of sailed. But I think the main criticism I have of the Good Friday Agreement is that it dismisses the notion of Ireland as one nation. And it brings this so-called new Ireland or agreed Ireland that they're talking about, or where it's not new, it's not agreed because it's based on it's based on the old sectarian dynamic. You could be British or you can be Irish, and it leaves an institutional link to the British Crown, which is why Sinn Féin are all over the place, greeting royalty, chasing royalty around Ireland, is to show unionists that you can remain a sort of post-colonial rump in our new Ireland. See, we don't even talk about our country anymore. It's just this island, because our country was one nation, but this island is two nations. So you have this avalanche of propaganda to basically inculcate in the Irish people a herd immunity against Irish republicanism, and to make people believe that the progressive and peaceful way forward is to continue with the two nations dynamic, which is totally counter to everything about Irish republicanism.
Irish Republicans always recognise that. I mean, Ulster Protestants are not going to wake up tomorrow morning and
that's right,
suddenly decide that they've been living under some sort of an illusion. But that's never the point. It was that you would have a 32 county republic, and that everybody, that both main communities within the island would be living under a sovereign Irish Republic, 32 county republic, and that was something when some Republicans said, look, we're going to have to make an allowance for these people, as people like Rory O'Brady would have done in the 1970s. You mightn't necessarily agree with what their structures that they set out in RNU, but at least they recognise that. And the ironic thing for me now is that the very people who are still in the background leadership in Sinn Féin, who attacked O'Brady and other people and Dáithí O'Connell as being sectarian for what they were proposing there in EU, have now reduced centuries of Irish republicanism and nationalism to a sectarian headcount. That they've no other strategy for achieving Irish unity other than this false notion that when there's a majority of Catholics in the 6 counties that they're going to vote for unity, of which there's no proof at all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if a border poll is so important and so vital to the strategic outcome, why didn't they support a border poll in 1973? They boycotted it. And the thing about it is, right, it's very important to remember the Ulster Unionists are a distinct community and they have rights. They definitely have rights, but they're not a separate nation. And even the British don't recognize that. And it's very important to bear in mind that partition wasn't brought in to protect the democratic right of Ulster Unionists. Partition was brought in specifically to deny the democratic right of Ireland as a whole to national self-determination. And it's amazing, I think, that the chattering classes in the South and the much of the media and much of the dominant ideology of the Southern state, who ignored Northern nationalists for decades until things got out of hand and blew out of control, are now bending over backwards to say to Ulster Unionists, what can we do to make you feel comfortable in this new Ireland? Can we get rid of the national flag? Can we get rid of the national anthem? Can we rejoin the British Commonwealth? And Sinn Féin are leading the charge on that. And that's why, Sinn Féin are boasting that, they, when Prince Charles or King Charles was over in Stormont Castle they're boasting that they dominated the proceedings and, took it from under the DUP's feet. But the Sinn Féiners didn't walk in there and just, they were placed there by the British. They were told where to stand. That was choreographed by the British. That pantomime was produced and directed by the British government to say to people that we may need new alliances in an all-Ireland context if the demographics go that way, and Sinn Féin will help us lead the charge on that, because the Shinners are saying, there is a royal, the whole point about republicanism was breaking the connection with England, right? And now they're saying is we're going to retain some sort of institutional link into the so-called future United Ireland, which is completely disunited, because what they're doing is they're talking about trading geographical unity for continuing civic division on a national level. It's the very antithesis of Irish republicanism. I call it the counter-republic.
Some of the Sinn Féin reaction to the census figures last week were, one person said, oh yeah, they were playing up this thing, when Northern Ireland was set up in 1921, 1922, that it was to create a Protestant state for a Protestant people. Now that may have been what Ulster loyalists and Ulster Protestants and Ulster Unionists was. The British didn't care less whether the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland was Protestant or Catholic or Jewish or atheist. It was the only qualification for the job was that he was going to run the 6 counties in the interests of Britain. And Sinn Féin have taken over that role in the last 20 years, and they don't seem to realise, they don't seem to understand the history of it, which is something I meant to ask you earlier. You seem to believe that all of this was choreographed and came about as part of a design. And we go back to when we were both in Portlaoise, 1993, 94, when the whole thing started to emerge, that there was some sort of plan. It came as a shock to us, I think. Came pretty much out of the blue. But I think, as you were implying earlier on, we did, well, certainly I did, I think most people consider that, they're not going to tell us everything, but you assume that they had made some sort of a deal behind the scenes, which the unions also seem to believe. And you realise after a while that the people who were supposed to be our leaders had not first notion of what they were at. And if they did, it certainly wasn't in the interest of why we were all where we were and what the Irish Republican movement was supposed to be about. So how deliberate and kind of calculated and cunning, if you want, for the want of a better word, do you think all that was? Do you think the people who were in the leadership of the Republican movement knew exactly where it was going to end, and that they manipulated and choreographed the whole thing for several years before it actually came, the ceasefire came in 1994?
I don't think they were that prescient or that capable that they were able to do that. But I think they had a lot of help from the British state security intelligence services and maneuvering in that direction. I'm not saying for a second that they were working for them, but they were going in the same direction. they had a joint program. And one of the things that, like I say in the book, is that what concerned me was that the provost, in order to move in that direction, they had to define peace as Britain defined peace, which was, no resistance to British rule. And, it was hard to stomach the country that was responsible for all the violence in this country, not all of it, but, for initiating it, and for, the primary responsibility for conflict in Ireland is the British government. And yet they defined the very concept of peace. But, I do believe that there were people, and I'm not tarring all the leadership with the same brush, because I know for a fact there were people in leadership that weren't comfortable. Now, they do bear collective responsibility for where we ended up. But I do believe that they were outmaneuvered themselves and marginalized in many ways. So I'm not tarring all of them with the same brush. But I do believe that there was a core group who seemed to have an amazingly charmed lives. And they were on a parallel agenda with the British state, which was to stabilize the situation and build a political dispensation that would basically provide career paths for people. And one thing that we learn in Irish history, we learned it in the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and we learn today, is never tempt a careerist with a career, because it's going to end badly. But for those of us who believed we were fighting for the full freedom and independence of Ireland to establish an Irish Republic, it was quite a shock. And I think one of the biggest shocks to me is that how few people in the Irish Republican movement actually held a genuine Republican philosophy. Some were Catholic nationalists, some were, actually genuine Republican, who didn't really want to make common cause with unionism, but wanted to defeat them. So the thing about it is, and didn't care if they defeated them within the context of the 6 counties, as long as they defeated them. And one of the things that disturbed me was, and you saw it with the pantomime that the Brits organized when King Charles came over, was unionists were left. Jeffrey Donaldson was left looking embarrassed and marginalized and sidelined, and people right away say, "This is fantastic. This is brilliant," because the unionists are upset. But the British are delighted. This is what the British want. They want to. I mean, I read a thing released under the 30-year rules. I have it there somewhere. I can provide it for you later if you want to research it yourself. It was written by a very senior civil servant at the NIO, and it was dated. I remember actually the date was the 5th of May, 1976, and he said that a strong provisional Sinn Féin running the show was in their interest, even if they eclipsed the SDLP, provided the provisional Sinn Féin, as they called them at the time, were acting in a responsible manner. Now, I don't think anybody could argue for 1 second that Sinn Féin are acting in what the British would call a responsible manner in everything they're doing.
You referred there just a minute ago to maybe many people in the Republican movement not having a conception of what exactly they wanted to see coming out of it, and you refer in the book to kind of the notion of republicanism as it came from United Irishmen, people like Wolfe Tone. But would you not also think that by the Irish cultural identity, the language and so on having been marginalised and greatly reduced, the numbers of Irish speakers is very small now, it's fallen precipitously even since the time of the United Irishmen, that the loss of that has also deprived people of a notion of what exactly they want to replace, what sort of republic they want. And I was struck by some of a lot of people who would consider themselves Republican, maybe vote Sinn Féin, that their nationalism is all tied to symbols, the soccer teams or flags, usually with some sort of inane slogan written across them. That it's like they're compensating for a lack of any real substance to them. And if you don't have, and I see the people you were referring to people in the Northern Ireland office and so on, they've centuries of accumulated knowledge and intelligence how to deal with national liberation movements, what their weak points are. And they're common, they're always common. You can see them in different countries, different African countries, which have ended up being neo-colonies of Britain as well. Apart from whatever military deficiencies there were, that there was also political deficiencies that people, they had this notion that this T-shirts are, Long Kesh, the University of Revolution, and people thought that Port was full of people who were, political geniuses.
Well, I mean, in a nutshell, I never detected any military strategy whatsoever, and in fact, I often heard them talk about a war of attrition. Well, if you're fighting a war of attrition, you don't have a strategy. Nobody who has a strategy fights a war of attrition. It's the ultimate symbol of a lack of a strategy. And they also had no political strategy. And I think the proof of the pudding in that is they completely internalized a British strategy. Like the Good Friday Agreement was negotiated between the British and Irish governments, right? Sinn Féin were not architects of this agreement. No matter how much they try to argue, they were peripheral on the sidelines. In fact, one Irish government official said they were in the dunce's corner, and they were. There was talks and discussions around prisoner releases, Irish Language Act, decommissioning, and things like that. But they absolutely were not architects of this agreement. And now I remember at the time being told, I'm sure you remember, Matt, being told this is not a Republican document. Keep your feet on the ground, but we'll see if we can work things in it. And people were willing to give them their head because people, unfortunately, trusted people who couldn't be trusted. And the thing about it is, a friend of mine who was very close to a member of the IRA Army Council, and this friend of mine is a very honest person, has never lied to me about anything in his life, told me that the member of the IRA Army Council told him there isn't a single Republican fingerprint on the Good Friday Agreement, right? Now, 25 years later, we're told we have to protect our agreement, we have to protect, our strategy. But it was a British strategy the whole way. And the strategy is what it's always been since the first Home Rule Act, to reconcile Irish nationalism with British sovereignty, right? Mm-hmm. And that was John Hume's theme. And the Sinn Féin have adopted that. They've given it a bit of a harder edge, and they've benefited electorally from that. But it's the sectarian dynamic in the North really that keeps this going. See, the British want control in Ireland with maximum influence with minimum footprint. They're quite happy to let Paddy run the show as long as they have ultimate control, as they do in the North. I mean, they can shut down Stormont any time. We've had a situation with the election on the Good Friday Agreement that the SDLP and the Dublin government were posting eclipsed the 1918 elections because people in the North voted for the multi-party agreement. People in the South voted to remove Articles 2 and 3, to change Articles 2 and 3. But the thing is, and then we were told by Bertie Ahern and people like that the democratic decision, the consensus to move forward in Ireland was now between Irish people. And if they could find that consensus, the British would not stand in the way. But cases taken in 2016 in the Belfast High Court by Raymond McCord, among others, and the Miller case in the UK Supreme Court the following January, on the Brexit issue, the courts confirmed, in no uncertain terms, that Westminster parliamentary supremacy ran supreme, and that no decision that any Irish person took in the North, especially, could outweigh the supremacy of the Westminster Parliament. So, actually, the argument was basically that the people in the North voted against Brexit, and that vote should be allowed. That and Westminster says no, it was a national vote in the UK, and basically Westminster Parliament is our supreme. Mm-hmm. So, in a nutshell, is you have a situation where you had the people in the North and South vote on the basic Good Friday Agreement. Like I said, in the North, they voted on the multi-party agreement. The South, they voted to alter Articles 2 and 3. And we're told that this was a 32-county electoral choice by the Irish people that has to be respected, right? But the British government, whatever electoral choice the Irish people made at that time. The British government make the political decisions. The power to make the political decision is in the hands of the British government. So the power to call a border poll is in the hands of a member of the British cabinet, an English politician who hasn't one single vote in this country, not one. And he can decide whether there's a border poll or not. And we're told that's democracy, but that's the oddest form of democracy that I've ever heard of.
Well, there won't be a border poll anyway.
Oh, there won't be a border poll. It's James Joyce, funny enough, almost 100 years ago, I think it was in 1908, talked about the home rule comet. The home rule comet, always tantalizing, always near, but never quite getting there. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That lasts for 40 years.
Sure, and even when they brought in home rule, they suspended it the same day. You know, so you're going to have this constant. It's around the corner. It's around the corner.
You see, it's like an Orwellian thing, or the way that big left-wing parties survived in Europe for years. The Italian Communist Party and the French Communist Party, even though they become completely institutionalized. Every time there's an election, they'd say, "Oh, socialism is coming out." Sinn Féin's equivalent of that is, "Oh, we're going to have a border poll. It'll be next year, it'll be year after, maybe after the next census, maybe after the next elections," and they know it's going to be beaten. And then when it's beaten, then it'll be another 7 years. So they'll get another 7 years out of that. Yeah. But I know people, and you probably know some of them yourself, from a place like Fermanagh, and they see through the whole thing. But when it comes to elections, they let themselves be swayed. Most of them let themselves be swayed by this. Plus the fact that these people who portray themselves as being woke liberals, they're not beyond going to people, knocking on doors and South Fermanagh and telling people, if you don't vote for whoever, then the Protestant is going to get the council seat or become the MLA. That's what they're reduced to.
Well, in the north, I mean, the sectarian dynamic has propelled them to where they are. In the south, their tails are up. But we must remember then, in the last local elections in 2019, they lost half their council seats. So
total disaster in councils.
Disaster. And
Dublin
had European elections. So at the minute, they're convincing themselves that they're on this unstoppable upward curve, and I think it's going to be stopped very rapidly if they ever do get into government and have to actually perform, because they can't cash these checks.
They may, however, be efficient at interning me and yourself. That's a joke.
Well, we can have this discussion in the Curragh. But the thing is, there's this, and they seem to think that they ride every horse in the race, they can't lose, but that will come to a crushing halt at some stage. But so it isn't about Sinn Féin. I don't really care about Sinn Féin. I don't care about their ambitions or their trajectories, or I don't care about all the unremarkable people who have found remarkable careers through internalizing a British strategy. What I care about is, can we get to the Irish Republic? And at the minute, there is really nobody arguing for it. In fact, there's almost an implication that if you do argue for, the Irish Republic, you're eccentric at best, or supporting violence at worst. And yet, there's something that does give me hope, because what gives me hope is when you cut through the fluff and the propaganda and the hype, the national flower in Ireland runs deep. It has very, very deep roots. And many times, weeds come up and they try to choke it off, but the flower runs deep. And I mean, and claiming the Republic, claiming the moral authority of the Irish Republic, which was declared twice, actually, in 1916 and again by the first Dáil in 1919, that carries enormous moral authority. And trying to undermine the moral authority of that Republic is a thing that exercises, the efforts of many journalists and many academics and many politicians over the years. To say, it wasn't really, that in other words, what they're trying to say is that the ideals of the 1916 proclamation, were met through the mechanism of partition and all the other nonsense.
I think I said to you before, I think it's like may sound pessimistic, but we're almost back to a situation that existed in the 1870s and the 1880s, where the island, on the promise of home rule, on a party that completely dominated national politics for 60 years, for 50 years, that even in that worst of time, that there were small signs of hope, the GA, the Conan na Gaeilge, the cooperative movement, the literary movement, that there was people, and then small groups of Republicans. You had Sinn Féin, various newspapers, Thomas Clark, MacDonagh, and people like that. And that, even though James Connolly, even though he would have differed from most of them on social economic issues, that there was all these small groups, and they were tiny groups. People forget how small they were because of what happened afterwards. But these groups kept saying that it doesn't matter what these people in Westminster, or the equivalent of Stormont at the time, or Leinster House, what they're saying is that it's nothing to do with creating an Irish Republic, Irish independence, and eventually enough people. But what the point I was trying to maybe badly make was that maybe that's where things have to go back to. It's a much like what Irish speakers are doing now, that can pop up Gael talks and Gael school and people like that. That if you don't have the support of the state, then you do it yourself.
We have to bring people back to the Republic. We have to, we have to articulate the Republican position, because Irish republicanism is very easy to understand, but it's very easy to forget, and we have to get back to that. And if you see a political document on the wall of a house or a government office, like, I've never seen the Anglo-Irish Treaty or the Good Friday Agreement stuck up anywhere. It'll be the proclamation. I mean, the Dublin government, the Irish government, has an Irish Army officer now read the proclamation of 1916 from the GPO every Easter now. He doesn't read, Article 8 of the treaty, which allowed the Free State to have an army. You know what I mean? So, I mean, it carries a normal moral significance and weight. And like I said, those roots run deep. And you look back to, the 1850s, after the famine, when Ireland was on its knees, like never before. I mean, absolutely. And you never could imagine that it could rise or get any sense of itself again. And 7 men, I think it was, met in a timber yard in Dublin and formed the Irish Republican Brotherhood. A number of them were Protestants. In fact, it was a Protestant who wrote the oath. 10 years later, they were a massive organization spread across several continents, and had the support in America of 1 million Irish immigrants, many of them who had training during the American Civil War. And it's amazing in the space of 10 years how they went from nothing to, So sometimes I wonder, why do they bother? If republicanism is so dead, and if Sinn Féin are actually leading the charge on burying Irish republicanism, which they absolutely are, and they're getting the fruits and benefits of it. But why do they bother? Why do they bother with the constant propaganda against it? And it's because, I have to come to the conclusion, because its roots are deep and they'll never kill it. And I think, we have to find ways to bring it back to the prominence it deserves. But as I've said before, the trouble is, republicanism has been shattered in this country like a pane of glass, into 100 pieces, and each piece thinks they're the true Republican movement, And I'm not sure. I mean, I don't have the answer how that can be done. I think it's usually events, as your man says. I think it was Macmillan. Events, my boy, events. Brexit probably has played a bigger role in changing, the political landscape that could go either way than any other event. You know what I mean? It certainly wasn't the Good Friday Agreement or anything like that, and it certainly wasn't anything the Provost did.
Just on a more personal note, I was just before I came out, I was looking at a photograph myself from 1991 or 1992. So when we were in Portlaoise, and I was looking at, I've done it before, but looking at there's about 90 to 100 people in. Some of them I know for definite. I would say less than half, and certainly no more than half of the people in that, and I'm sure it probably applies to the H blocks and other prisoners who are in England. Less than half those people, half at the most, are fully behind what Sinn Féin are doing at the moment. And just like the last question, is more on a personal note. I fortunately missed your book launch in Monaghan, mainly for the reason to meet people I hadn't seen for a long time.
There's going to be another one in Dublin, but anyway. So,
what impression would you get? What is the general impression you get from, say, there's people who had been on during the H-box, they've been on the blanket, they've been there during the hunger strikes, people who spent long times in Portlaoise, I know people who were in England. Maybe I'm just pessimistic, get kind of a mixture of anger and kind of just despair of what's happened, insofar as you think about it. A lot of people just put out there.
Even during the after the treaty debates, something like 80% of the IRA were against the treaty, but that doesn't really matter when the claim jumpers and the carpetbaggers and the place seekers are coming out of every nook and cranny, and they overwhelm that. They overwhelm the principled people, or the people who have the courage to stand and defend the Republic. And I found a lot of that with you. In my opinion, most thinking Republicans, I believe, that I've met, wouldn't be happy with the direction. Others who let their people do their thinking for them, either they're happy with it or they're paid to be happy with it. That's what I find. But I don't see how any Irish Republican can be happy with a situation where the sectarian dynamic we're going to have a so-called United Ireland, where we'll have institutional links with the British Crown, and we'll maintain the British-Irish cleavage in our national loyalty. It's the antithesis of republicanism.
They're afraid to face up to what you've done in this book and other people have done, to recognise that, no, we didn't win, and these are the reasons why we didn't win. Whereas many people seem to be, and some of them, you can't even talk to them because...
they're saying we fought the Brits to a standstill. For Christ's sakes, outside of a small enclave in South Armagh, the Brits had total command of the strategic landscape. We even know now that the head of our security was working for them, as was others, and it's the tip of the iceberg. Gerry Adams said at Jim Lynagh's grave in 1987 that Loughgall would be the tombstone of British rule in Ireland. Now, the British are still here, and the Irish Republican Army are buried. So anybody who thinks that's victory just because a bunch of people got jobs out of it, and fair play to them, but I'm not going to wear that hat ever. I'm going to stand with my Republican comrades and defend the Irish Republic to my last breath. And I've done it physically in my life, and now I have to do it morally. But I will not be intimidated out of this. I will not be deflected from this. And I know a lot of people who think like me. And the thing about it is, what we have to decide is how can we gather that? How can we nurture that and build it into something that can actually bring the Irish Republicanism back to center stage? And that's the question we have to ask, and that's what we have to look towards. I don't have the answer to that, but I know a lot of people are looking for those answers. Hopefully they'll come in time.
Appropriate point at which to end. Thank you, John, and best of luck. See you at the next book launch, I hope.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.